welcome to the first event of today at the World Storytelling Cafe at the 2025 Marrakech International Storytelling Festival, and I am honoured to present the twins and friends who will be introduced by Tahir Shah, and he will explain why the whole family is so important to this and many other projects around the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. And hey, what a delight. This is fabulous to be here. So I'm Tahir Shah. Some of you know that already. Others don't. Before I start, I want to start this way. I live in Morocco. I live in Casablanca. And Marrakechis, people in Marrakech here, don't really like Casablanca, but for all kinds of reasons. But I drove down here a couple of days ago, and I want you all to remember something. You probably came by flight, but I drove. Okay, I didn't. I should have walked or crawled on my knees to appreciate where we are. We are deep in the desert. This is not, okay, it's a city, but it is a city in the desert. Okay, this sounds tacky and crazy, but I'm going to run with it. Can we all just close our eyes for like 10 seconds and think where we are? We're in the desert. We're in crazy, bustling, rustling Marrakech. But this was an ancient caravanserai of camels and fonduks and palm trees and storytellers. Like thousands of years ago, the seed of this great metropolis fell not far from where we're sitting now I like to think in Jamal Fna, and the city grew and grew just like something from Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, just like a story, like the story of, if you know it, Maruf the Cobbler. I've got goosebumps telling you this because the fact that I'm in Morocco is no coincidence. I'm in Morocco because I'm so in awe of this culture and the mindset and the way that fact and fantasy are blurred together in the most extraordinary alchemy and hybrid of life, the universe, and everything. And really, that's the most wonderful thing to me. And the fact that we are all here today and other people joining online, it's because there's something about Morocco. It's not a normal, ordinary country. It's not Europe. It's not the Americas. It's not the rest of Africa or Australia or Latin America. It's its own thing. Morocco is this extraordinary mixture. To me, it is an alchemy, and this is the crucible. And we're just incredibly, incredibly fortunate to be here and now and be part of it. And it sounds nuts, but I've lived here a lot of the time over the last 20 or so years. And I go on and on about it all the time. And I've written a few books about Morocco. I wrote this one called In Arabian Nights, which is about stories. It's called Morocco Through Stories. And I've written other stuff about Morocco, and what I've tried to do is show how folklore and how stories have shaped normality here. And it is the most magical, absurd, glorious normality that I'm hoping with time everyone else will take on too. I know some countries like Germany, it's going to take longer than others because not knocking them, but they have a longer, the United States maybe, but they have a longer, more glorious journey ahead of them. In our family, stories are more important than anything else. And as John said, my father, my twin sister is here. So our dad was a writer called Idris Shah. And he was very, very preoccupied with stories and so-called teaching stories, stories that contain wisdom and ideas and information that can be used as a kind of what he would call an instruction manual to the world. And his sister, our aunt, Amina Shah, we grew up with her and our father and others telling stories. From the moment we woke up in the morning, people would tell stories. They would tell stories about kings and queens and dragons and jinn and magical monsters and ifrit, and they would even tell stories about stories. And this was our normality. And later it was strange for us to go out into the world and realize that some countries didn't have this this bedrock, or they did, but the people had forgotten that it existed. And I'm going to come to that in a moment. I'm just going to ramble on for a few minutes, and then I'm going to invite a couple of my buddies who happen to be there and there to join me. But in our family, there's a tradition, and the tradition is that when there's more than a handful of people together, it's good practice and good manners to begin with a story. And although some of the stories told by our family are as long as entire books or longer, I'll begin with a short one. And it's a story that goes around my head most of the time. And it's a story about a little stream. Once upon a time, long, long ago, in a very far off land, which probably wasn't very far from here actually, because it was definitely Morocco. And it was definitely in the Atlas Mountains, in this version anyway. A tiny, tiny little source of water bubbled up out of the ground. And as the first droplets gushed out of the top of a little mountain, the little water source thought to itself, oh my gosh, this is amazing. The sun, there's everything, and I've been in the ground for so long, and what is this? There's air, there's light, I can breathe. I was in the ground. And the source of water went down the mountainside, a little tiny trickle. And as more and more of it came out of the ground, got a little bit bigger and got more and more enthusiastic and excited. And it came down as a tiny stream from the top of the Atlas Mountains, down, 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 getting bigger and bigger, and it went between boulders and cacti, and it passed villages. Still quite a small stream, and eventually it reached the plain. And as it reached the plain, the desert plain, it was rejoicing. My gosh, just nothing can hold me back. I will reach the ocean, it was saying, far, far away. But suddenly, as it reached the plain, the desert plain, its water, its droplets began to be sucked down into the desert sands. And the little stream was going, oh no, what's happening to me? I'm a tiny little stream, I don't know what's happening. I don't want to go back into the ground. I went up in the ground for so long. What am I going to do? And then it heard a voice, and the voice was an old wise voice. And the old wise voice said, I know what you are. You're a stupid little stream. You were in the ground, and you came up through the mountain. You've come down the mountain. You've reached the desert, and you're going to be sucked down, like it or not, unless you change your form. And the desert said, think, little stupid, little young stream. Think back to another time when you were something else, when you were not just a young stream. And the stream said, I'm a little stream, I just came out of the ground and came down the mountain. Here I am, I don't want to go back to the desert. That's the stream voice.
A very high voice,
The stream was young and high voiced and panicked. But suddenly the stream did think back. It thought and it thought and it thought and it thought. It remembered that at another time there was another time when it had been something else. And it remembered and it remembered and it remembered. And the desert again said, little stream, you must change your form. It said, if you remember, You've crossed me many, many times before. You and your ancestors have crossed me, little stream, and you've been the river before, and you've been the ocean before. You can cross me again, but you will have to change your form. And so the little stream did something very clever. It allowed itself, its waters, droplets, to be sucked up into the wind and to be blown across the desert sands, and then to gather on a mountainside far away and become a stream again. That's a story that my sister knows, my friend Jason knows, Sally, you know it, and we grew up with that story. It's called The Tale of the Sands, and it's a story that was told to us endlessly as kids. And it's a story, along with many others, that are part of us. And what I want to say about stories and storytelling, to me and to us, some of us, I think all of us, it's a total obvious thing. These stories that we tell and we retell, they're far more than entertainment. They are far more even than a magical alchemy. They are part of us, and in a way they are us. We are the stories that we tell and the stories that have been told to us. And there's a wonderful story that many of you may know called the story of Mushkil Gusha, and which is often told on a Thursday night. I'm not going to tell it, don't worry. And there's a point in Mushkil Gusha that I love. The old woodcutter is having a very bad day, and a lot of bad things have happened to him, and he's like really sick of whatever's happened. So he sits down and he decides to tell himself the version of his day, his story so far. And in my life, I live this strange life, living in this strange, formerly haunted with jinns, if you believe it, mansion in Casablanca. And often I sit down on the sofa when I'm having a very bad day, just like Mushkil Gusha, and I think, Tahir Shah, let's sit you down and tell yourself the story of what you've gone through, you poor little lamb. And I'm like, you poor little thing. And I'm like, yeah, I am, I've had a horrid time. And the fact, this is kind of a serious point though, the fact that I tell myself the story of what has happened to me in the privacy of my own little room or office, this way of telling a story to myself, just like in Mushkil Gusha, which I learnt it from, has a healing mechanism on me. And it sounds nuts, but it's something that I hope we'll talk about in a moment with Sally and Jason. But I think what we've all learnt, and we all know, even though some of us don't recognize it or discuss it, stories have this machinery. They're a matrix. Like I said, our father used to say they were an instruction manual to the world. The way I've learned to appreciate stories is that they can enable us in actually a complex psychological way, and we'll discuss it. They can enable us to view our position, our relationships, our course, just like the little stream going down the mountain. They can enable us to think and rethink the various pieces of our lives and other people's lives, and they can enable us to triumph in times when we would otherwise be beaten. There's something that we've been brought up with, and it's this idea that, as I say, stories are far more than entertainments. Our dad, Idris Shah, the writer and thinker, would always say to us, a story is kind of like a peach. It's like a piece of fruit. It's told and retold and told again because it has this delicious flesh that people bite into and they just think it's the most yummiest thing ever, and they can't quite get enough of this taste and the texture. But the thing of real value in the story isn't the entertainment at all. It's not the flesh of the peach. It is the stone at the heart of that piece of fruit. The stone at the heart usually gets thrown into the garbage, but it ultimately finds its way and is planted by the winds of time and fate. But the thing of value is the stone. But the thing we all regard as the only thing of importance about the peach is the flesh. And the flesh is the entertainment, although it has its own role to play. There's something I think of often, and it's the way, as our dad used to go on, that these stories, there are different kinds of stories. There are stories that are only entertainments, for sure, but there are stories that are these complex psychological and anthropological documents in their own right. But in the Occidental world, in the West, what happens to hit me day in, day out while I live in Morocco is I see that here people will tell a story to give an example. They'll tell a story about the wise fool of Oriental folklore, Joha, the character that we grew up knowing in his Afghan identity, Nasruddin, Mullah Nasruddin. But often in the Occidental world, people forget that particular stories were created by geniuses in, throughout the twists and turns of humanity to pass on extraordinarily complicated ideas for society and humanity. This is the Noah's Ark that can save humanity in a way, and it's a Noah's Ark of folklore that has been passed on in such a genius way, so brilliantly, that most of the time we forget that it is what it is. It's rather like this. Imagine if there was a kingdom far away where there were no board games and no games at all. Imagine a place where there were farms and cities and villages and kinds of people, but there were no games because the king didn't like games because he couldn't win them. And so you can imagine this in so many countries or places even now. So the games were made null and void and illegal. You couldn't play games. And this kingdom, I'll call it the kingdom of Zog. I'm making this up. The kingdom of Zog, where the king decreed that games would be illegal. It was cut off from the outside world. Time passed and it was still cut off from the outside world. And after a long time, a farmer, when the games were decreed null and void and illegal, sometimes people buried their games because they had games, but centuries passed, and one day a farmer was digging his field and he struck a big metal chest and he dug it up. He was all excited and he thought there was treasure inside. And he opened it up, and imagine this, in the chest there was a very, very beautiful golden board with silver squares and gold squares, and there were 8 this way and 8 that way, and there were these strange figurines, and he thought, this is just a lovely thing, maybe it's something that people used to worship or whatever. And just when he had dug it up, imagine that soldiers from the royal palace saw him, and they dragged him and the treasure chest and objects to the palace, and he was thrown in front of the king, who was the descendant of the king who had forbidden games to exist. And imagine that the king took possession of this object, and dignitaries would be brought in from all corners of the kingdom to discuss the beauty of this object. But then one day, a visiting prince from a far-off kingdom did come to this kingdom of Zog, and he said to the king, well, shall we play? And the king, Zog, of the kingdom of Zog, distant ancestor of the king who had forbidden games, said, are you deliberately trying to insult me? What do you mean play? And the prince from the far off kingdom said, this is the game of chess. My point with this, which I've sort of just made up, is that this is a very beautiful object. It's a very beautiful thing. It's a chessboard with pieces, and we can admire it, just like we can admire a story, the craftsmanship, the eloquence of it. But we can also use it as a tool. It's a didactic, amazing tool that can change our mental state and change the way we think and perceive the world. We could play chess with a chessboard, but we could admire it too. And what we've been brought up to do, my sister Safia and me and others, our other sister and others, we've been brought up to appreciate stories, but to allow them to work on us. When I was a kid, our dad once said to me, these stories work in this magical way. And I remember saying to him, Baba, but I don't know how to understand them. And he said, calm down, that is the real magic of folklore, of stories, of teaching stories in particular. You listen to them, particularly in oral form. And that's why, for me, the World Story Festival and Cafe is so important, because these are oral tellings. It's much more important when a story goes through your ears, I think, although I'm a writer, this is important. We don't need to understand how it works, just like we don't need to understand how the proteins in a plate of food break down and nourish us. But we need to believe in them. And through stories like, for example, and this is something that is so important to us, stories that maybe have a beginning, middle, and end, but are not necessarily the type of stories that we've grown to appreciate through, for example, Disney. Disney, although here I have a lamp of Disney, Aladdin. Aladdin is part of Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, the greatest treasury of stories ever created in the history of humanity. Rather than, and I'm not knocking these new modern renditions of stories, but I think it's incredibly important to remember, a little bit like the stream coming down the mountainside in the Tale of the Sands, it's important to remember another time when stories didn't always have a clear and beautiful payoff at the end, or didn't always have an arc that could be told in the 2-hour version of a movie. But a story, 1001 Nights, it's up to 7,000 pages or longer, depending on, or shorter, doesn't really matter the length. What's important is that a story challenges your ability to think in different ways, and that it leaves you kind of befuddled. There's an example, here's an example. The medieval wise fool of Oriental folklore who I mentioned, Johar. I can call him in Morocco Johar. If I call him Nasruddin, if there were any Afghans here, they'd say Mullah Nasruddin. I've been to Afghanistan and you say Johar, and they're like, who the hell's that? But they tell exactly the same stories in Afghanistan and Marrakech about the same character. You can go to Albania, Greece, you can go to Turkey, Iran, Iraq, so many countries, and they tell the stories of this character. He goes by all kinds of names, just like the stories themselves. It doesn't matter who he's called or what he's called, but what matters is the psychology of this mechanism. My very favorite Nasruddin story, and I'm just going to end with this, because in the same way that our father would tell us, it's good manners to begin with a story. He said it's good manners to end with a story. And then I'm going to bring on my two special guests. It's this. Mullah Nasruddin had the most demonic, horrendous, awful, mother-in-law in the world. And he hated her. But he was always trying to impress her. Because he knew if he could impress her just once, she might like him. And she was supposedly a good cook, although she was always trying to poison him when he came over to her house. So the mother-in-law was coming over. She announced that she would be coming over, and Nasruddin, you better prepare a meal that is fit for your mother-in-law. And he thought, well, I don't even know what to cook, but I don't even have a pot big enough for her ego, let alone the ingredients to fill it. Then he remembered, well, my neighbor has a pot. And he thought, I'll go and ask my neighbor for the pot. But then he remembered that the neighbor was the greediest, nastiest person, even greedier and nastier and more egotistical than his mother-in-law. But summoning all his courage, he went over to the neighbor's house and he knocked at the door and he said, dear neighbor, my mother-in-law's coming. You know what they're like, the mother-in-laws. She's got a huge ego and I don't have a pot big enough to serve a meal fine enough for her. Could I please borrow your big pot? And the neighbor, this actually sounds so Moroccan because I can imagine it in Casablanca or Marrakech. And the neighbor said, of course not. I won't lend you my pot, it's my pot. And how do I know it'll be clean? How do I know you'll take care of it? How do I know it won't be dented? Nasruddin said, look, just believe in me this one time. So after a lot of pleading and begging, Nasruddin went home with the neighbor's pot, allowed to use it for one night only. He cooked the most sublime meal that he had ever cooked. The mother-in-law was like, well, this is not so bad. She even had seconds, and she was nervous that he was now trying to poison her, but then she didn't drop dead, and she was quite impressed. And the next morning, Nasruddin returned the pot, spick and span, so clean, to his neighbor's house. And the neighbor inspected the pot and said, all right, you did as you said, do this once. And Nasruddin said, oh, I forgot to tell you, just before I go, a really, really strange thing happened last night. I just don't know what it was, maybe because my mother-in-law was in the house. After I had used your pot and cleaned it, your pot, your big, beautiful cooking pot, it gave birth to another pot, a little lovely pot, just a little one. And because the big pot's yours, I guess I've got to give you the little pot. The neighbor was thrilled. He was like, whoa, this is fabulous. So the next time the mother-in-law dropped by and Nasruddin borrowed the pot, the neighbor was all too happy to lend his big pot again because he thought maybe there'll be more pot progeny. And the day after the pot had been borrowed for the second time, Nasruddin didn't return the big pot. And the neighbor came over to Nasruddin's house, knocked at the door and said, oh, I've come to get my big pot, and by the way, any little pots that it gave birth to in the night. And Nasruddin looked grave, and he said, we cooked the great dinner, it was fabulous, I washed the pot, but then at 10 minutes past 12 last night, something very awful happened. And the neighbor said, what? Nasruddin said, well, we have established, have we not, that pots can be born, live full lives, and then die. And Nasruddin said, at 10 minutes past 12 last night, I regret to inform you your pot dropped dead. So that is Nasruddin and the pot.